Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. I am delighted once more to collaborate with Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, and on behalf of Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, we are delighted that you are joining us for this session on supervision and leadership. I welcome you to utilize the features within Zoom that will serve you best, from management of your audio, mute and unmute, as well as the chat and some of the interaction that I'll encourage along the way. And certainly throughout, if you have questions, I welcome you to share those in the manner that you are most comfortable with through the chat or raising your hand, as well as using reactions to get our attention. And between Stefan and I, we will attend to those requests as best as we are able to throughout. And then certainly at the end of the session, we'll take some opportunity for questions as well. So a few more of the administration items as we begin. This opportunity that we refer to as a safety connection allows us to share information, further that collaboration and networking with partners between OFVGA and WSPS and the sector in general, and including those who are your peers within the sector and participants within this session. So please do share your insights, ask your questions, and provide your thoughts to some of those questions or requests that may arise as well. The information within this session may have some difference between the description in the invitation and what we have on this slide and the content that I'll share with you through the presentation. So to level set between those differences for the moment, the invitation suggests that our conversation will focus upon somewhat of employer responsibility to ensure that a supervisor has been provided with the information, resources, and tools such as training to be effective in their role. And I will definitely include that theme throughout the content. However, the specific duties of an employer we will entertain in the series of these webinars. So I welcome you to please look out for that next invitation for the next in the series and join us to have that specific conversation on the role of the employer. Our focus for today will be on the role of the supervisor, those who are the leaders within each of your operations and have some authority and ultimately some care, control, and charge over process and perhaps people within the workplace. And to do so, we'll have some conversation on the basics, the duties that are established in legislation, as well as rights that are available to those not only in the role of the supervisor, but those in the role of a worker. And we will find that actually that may be one and the same for those who are in leadership roles within our workplaces. We'll also talk, though, about how the duties that are established for our leaders truly do support the rights of those who are within their care in the workplace as well. And of course, we'll take some opportunity to discuss resources that are available to support employers who have supervisors, as well as those who are in the role as supervisors in particular.
Alexa, turn off.
To begin that conversation on the basics, we will reinforce the legislation that is in place in the province and applicable to farming operations. And for those who may have been a participant within the last in this series, we did discuss this legislation to some extent at that point as well. And here a reminder that farming operations, the sector, has been under this legislation for, my goodness, it is nearing 20 years at this point, which means my career is nearing 20 years too. The Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulation for farming operations became applicable for the sector in that time of a couple of decades ago. Now, there has been some changes to legislation over those years that are also applicable to the sector, such as the requirements for awareness training and management of noise hazards, for example. We are going to focus on some of the general duties that are found within the Act, less so the regulations and some of the hazard-specific content for this discussion. But definitely, if you have questions on those topics, I welcome you to share those and we can entertain those through or at the end of our time together today. So to begin, within the Occupational Health and Safety Act, we have a definition of a supervisor, and that includes just a few words that really have tremendous impact in the workplace. A supervisor is defined by this legislation as a person who has charge of a workplace or authority over a worker. There are two parts in that definition, separated by that word or, one or the other, and quite often both with an and are relevant for the role of a supervisor. It is important to note as well, and here I will reinforce an employer responsibility, that a supervisor must be a competent person. Now, competent is a definition within this legislation as well that we will review together in just a moment. So the role for a supervisor truly begins with the employer responsibility, and that is to appoint competent people as supervisors. It is then that individual who takes on the role of a supervisor has the authority or the charge placed upon their role and the duties that follow. Now, determining if a supervisor is a supervisor is truly an objective test based on their actual duties or powers within the workplace. It is not simply by the position, title, or how we refer to the individual within the workplace. It is strictly about their role, what they do, how they do that role within the workplace. So even though we might have an individual that we describe as a team leader or a manager, or perhaps we have even used the term supervisor, it really is less about the term and so much more about their duty. So as you reflect on the various roles within your operations, compare each of those roles to this definition. Even if that individual has the position of an operator or laborer, or perhaps worker is the term that is common. In their role, though, do they have any capacity for charge or authority? And if so, even though their position or title might not have led us to that role of a supervisor, by role and function within the workplace, they are nonetheless. We'll come back to some of that exploration of who is and who may not be a supervisor by definition in just a moment. Before we do, though, let's explore a little further those words charge and authority. And at this point, I'll make comment on a resource available from the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development. The MLITSD has prepared a guide or resource with the title Supervisors, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. This is a resource that we will share with you following this session. It is a document available on the ontario.ca website that provides some context as well as interpretation on these terms, charge and authority. And we'll put these in a versus situation for a moment because they are different. Charge of a workplace refers to that broad control over organizing, designing, and planning work, the process, how things are done within the workplace. Whereas authority over a worker refers to a somewhat more specific power to ensure compliance of others to standards in the workplace. So as we bring those to a versus situation, charge might indicate that I do have power to design step 1 through 10 of how the work is done, but I do not necessarily need or have power over the individuals who are going to perform step 1 through 10. Now, I might also be a frontline supervisor who does have individuals who perform the tasks, and I guide, coach, reinforce, correct, and manage the performance of those individuals. But I did not design step 1 through 10. That has been provided to me by a manager or employer. So when we have this versus situation in farming operations, it is quite often 2 hats that one individual will wear. The employer or the supervisor quite often will both design, organize, or plan the work, as well as manage the performance of the individuals who do the work. But there really is a bit of a divide. So keeping in mind even those who we might refer to as coordinators, planners, or organizers are also supervisors, since their work has impact on the work of others. And of course, if we bring this back to occupational health and safety in particular, if within steps 1 through 10, there is a risk, there is an exposure that may result in a loss of some type, that individual in the design does need to have responsibility then to evaluate and be sure once that step 1 through 10 is provided on to a frontline supervisor to manage performance of individuals who will perform the work, that there is not some fatal flaw written within the process. And similarly, for that frontline supervisor who will manage the work of the individuals performing step 1 through 10, also need to have that power to course correct along the way where perhaps there is something new, different, or unique. And that original step 1 through 10 may no longer suffice. Within that authority can make some change and continue that protection of the workers. So charge or authority. If in the role of individuals within the workplace, truly those individuals are supervisors. And once more, often within this sector, we find that we are wearing both hats or fulfilling both parts of the definition as well. Now, further within the guide that has been provided by the ministry, there are a few examples that the ministry has provided. I would describe those as interpretations of the definition of a supervisor. And the format the ministry has used are as indicators. And some of those indicators that the ministry considers to be primary, or if I may, without question, these are supervisor functions, include those who have the power to hire, fire, or discipline. And that's pretty common in understanding. If I have that power, I am, without question, the employer perhaps, or at least a supervisor. Even if I have the opportunity to recommend to hire, fire, or discipline, I have some influence over that decision. Perhaps to promote, demote, or transfer. I have power within my role to adjust the work that others perform. Then even related to compensation, whether that is truly the rate of pay, perhaps bonuses, incentives, might also be related to the schedule. If I have some opportunity to influence the hours of work, the leaves or hours away from work, even organization of a group or crew or team who is going to perform tasks. Who do we need to put into that mix to get the work done? Each of those efforts considered to be primary indicators of that role of a supervisor. And most of those are relatively obvious. Now, another primary indicator with that lens of occupational health and safety in particular is those who have the power to enforce standards that have been set to protect worker health and safety. So if within my tools in the workplace, I can hold individuals accountable to ensure that they follow the process, use the protective devices, guards, or personal protective equipment, and also reinforce where there is that positive performance. All of those considered to be indicators for that role of a supervisor. Now, where it does become perhaps a little curious are some of the following functions. Even without any of those primary indicators or those that are relatively common in our understanding of a supervisor, what if an individual has the opportunity to determine the tasks to be done and by whom? Direct, monitor, evaluate, correct, or reinforce the work that is being performed. Decide on equipment, materials, tools to perform the work. Direct others, perhaps even to attend to concerns that are brought forward by workers related to occupational health and safety. Every one of those lines still does have some influence on how people perform work, and certainly those with the lens of occupational health and safety, the potential for exposure to risks or control of those risks. So if we consider that the more authority a person has over workers, over others, or how others perform that work, the greater the likelihood is that individual is a supervisor. So charge, how we design, organize, plan, or authority to set and hold accountable individuals to standards within the workplace. Any of those are considered to be functions of a supervisor. And some of the time, we may move in and out of the role of a supervisor, depending on the scope of work, the point in the season, how many groups of workers we now have to divide up may require a greater number of supervisors as well. And once more, an employer responsibility to ensure that we have prepared our supervisors well to take on those functions. So even if it is for the period of planting, harvest, clean or tear out, we have an individual who has been given that control or power, and then they might step back out of it again for that period of time, ensuring that individual has been prepared well and is well informed of their responsibilities and accountabilities. Now, another important point to note as well is that not only might we arrive in the role of a supervisor, but perhaps we are in a role where we're still questioning, well, I give instructions or I do give words to others on how to perform their work. Am I a supervisor or not? And that question we break down using that charge and authority just a little bit further. An individual who respectfully, but merely relays the instructions or words from a supervisor and then reports back to that supervisor, either on how it is going or perhaps for more words, is likely not considered to be a supervisor. And once more respectfully, if that same supervisor had written down step 1 to 10 on a page and handed it to each worker, that paper does not become the supervisor. And neither does the individual who is truly reciting the words from perhaps a paper or from that conversation that has been completed with the supervisor. So we may arrive into the role as a supervisor, but only where there is charge and authority. Even though we might be a part of the communication path between a supervisor and a worker, we might not be holding that accountability or responsibility as a supervisor. It gets a little confusing, but bring it back to that definition, charge or authority. The other definition I alluded to is that of competent. And in particular, a competent person, as indicated, is a supervisor, an individual that has been appointed by the employer. And if we expand upon that duty for our employer, the employer is to appoint a competent person as a supervisor. And if we are reading left to right, start to end of that responsibility in the legislation, the prompt is the employer must prepare that individual, ensure that that individual is competent before they would arrive in that role of a supervisor. Now, on occasion, we do have a little cart before horse or supervisor before competent. By the law, though, the intention here is to be sure those individuals who have now taken on the accountability and responsibility are ready for that work. Set those individuals up for success so they can then set up the workers that they will have responsibility over, or the process that they will have charge of for success as well. Now, competent has 3 parts in its definition. All 3 parts must be in place in order to define an individual as a competent person. And that includes that the individual is qualified, and this is typically through knowledge, experience, and training, some informal, some practical, what is reasonable to organize the work and its performance, not only by the individual, but by those who that individual will have authority over, or in designing that process. A competent person is also familiar with the Occupational Health and Safety Act and any regulations that apply to the work performed in that workplace. So in farming operations, we acknowledge that there are a few regulations, but each of those, where applicable to the work, are important for the supervisor to be familiar with, so that not only does the supervisor understand those minimum rules, but can communicate that information to the workers that they may have authority over, or again, plan that within the process. A competent individual is also knowledgeable about the hazards that result in those actual or potential risks for losses within the workplace. So specifically, any of those potential or actual dangers to health or safety for those workers who might be impacted by the work. So if we summarize that definition and its 3 parts as an individual who is competent, is qualified, is knowledgeable about the hazards and controls for protection of workers and is familiar with the legislation that applies to occupational health and safety in the workplace. Some of the time, that word qualified is used interchangeably with competent. And really, there is some difference between these terms. We see that qualified is within the definition of competent, but competent may not be within the definition of qualified. It is important to understand some of that difference in application of this legislation, as well as fulfillment of responsibilities as a supervisor. So once more, if we position competent versus qualified in a similar way to our previous example of charge and authority, competent has its own definition, as we have just reviewed. And generally, that individual has demonstrated or proved, given their employer some assurance, they have knowledge and skills to perform the work. Qualified, as we saw, was a part of that definition. Qualified by its own definition, though, indicates that a person has some credential. They have met some requirement for often a specific skill, task, or perhaps it is a broader position. So that individual might have a driver's license, which indicates that person is a qualified driver. Now, I'll ask you to evaluate for yourself, is every driver competent? Does every driver know and follow the rules of the road? Does every driver look forward to those actual or potential risks and implement effective controls? And since most of the news this morning was about incidents on the roads, I'll suggest not. So a competent person must be qualified, but a qualified person may not, and by definition does not, need to be competent. But we sure appreciate when they are on the road and elsewhere. Now, further in the legislation, from definitions on to duties. And once more, if you did attend the last session in this series, we did explore in general the internal responsibility system and each of the roles and the general application of duties. Now, for a role of supervisors and to meet that definition of competent, it is important to look at the specific duties as set out in the legislation. And hence we have a very full slide of words. This is the excerpt from the Occupational Health and Safety Act, formatted in a slightly different way, bullets rather than numbers. But ultimately, the hierarchy and language is the same as we would see if we were to open the Green Book. Now, a person in the role of a supervisor must have sufficient authority provided by the employer to carry out the duties or the words that we have on the screen. These words are from the Occupational Health and Safety Act, Section 27. And specifically, a supervisor shall ensure that a worker, and if I use some common language rather than legal language for a moment, shall ensure is make sure, right? You have to be really confident. There has to be some evidence provided to you that what follows is in place. So a supervisor must make sure that a worker works in the manner and with the protective devices, measures, and procedures required by the Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations, and uses or wears the equipment, protective devices, or clothing that the worker's employer requires to be used or worn. So if I add some more common language here, a supervisor must make sure that a worker follows the rules, including the law and standards that have been set in the workplace, such as the use of protective devices and PPE. Further, a supervisor shall, or a supervisor must, advise a worker of the existence of any potential or actual danger to the health or safety of the worker of which the supervisor is aware. Where prescribed or set in regulation, provide a worker with written instructions, and the heavy, take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of a worker. So if I add some more common language here, a supervisor must communicate information on hazards and controls to protect workers. And a supervisor must always look ahead, beside, and behind to evaluate where there may be a potential for risk to a worker, or certainly if there has been a loss involving a worker, and implement controls that will eliminate or at least reduce those experiences. Every reasonable precaution is heavy, a little vague, but so important that our supervisors and employers who hold the same duty are always considering opportunities for improvement and protection of the workers in the workplace. This is Section 27 from the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and I encourage you, if not yet, take a hold of your green book, find your way to that particular section, and review on occasion the words within those duties that are placed upon our supervisors. And as supervisors, then evaluate, do you have the tools that you need to fulfill each of the words within that section? And if not, that's a conversation to be had with your employer. Your employer must set you up for success. And as an employer, ensure that you do provide your supervisors with any tools needed to fulfill the words within Section 27. Now, for a moment, I will highlight the worker duties. Supervisors are workers too. As well, supervisors may have charge or authority over other people, workers in the workplace. And it is important to be familiar with the requirements for those roles as well. As workers, individuals must carry out duties in the Occupational Health and Safety Act, Section 28 for workers. And those include, in summary, that a worker must comply with the standards of the legislation as well as those that have been set by the employer, such as the use of equipment, protective devices, PPE, report opportunities for improvement or hazards, including any broken rules in the workplace. And there are some prohibitions that workers must not. Workers must not work in a way that is likely to be a danger to themselves or others. And there are some specifics written within the legislation, from avoiding contests, feats of strength. I can only imagine the reasons why some of these words have become rules in the Green Book, but no doubt they have been incidents at some frequency and severity. Now, similar to the duties for workers which are available for our supervisors, so too are the rights. As well, many of the supervisor duties will support the rights of workers. Now, workers have the three basic rights in this province to know, participate, and refuse unsafe work. And if I begin with refuse unsafe work, in the role of a supervisor, although it may not become a common task, it is important to understand the process that is set out in legislation to follow in the event of a work refusal, so that protection is established for all involved and duties are fulfilled effectively. As we move on to participate, as a supervisor, and in particular as a leader, ensuring we do provide the opportunity or mechanisms and methods for workers to be a part of the process of protection in the workplace, recognizing and controlling hazards, making suggestions or recommendations. Now, that may be as a health and safety representative or member of the Joint Health and Safety Committee, but this right is to be available to all workers, which means even those who are not in the roles of a member of the committee or representative, there are to still be mechanisms or methods to provide that information. So as a supervisor, that might be through being approachable and open to receiving information, as well as prompting through questions and observations, requests of your workers where they may have those really great ideas in mind that they have just not brought forward yet. And the right to know, one of the more obvious rights of our workers that the supervisor will support. The supervisor specifically has the duty, as we reviewed, to inform workers about any of the hazards and controls the supervisor is aware of. You can only share the information that you have yourself. But once you do have it, ensure that you do share that information with workers. What the hazards are, how to control the hazards, and if not effectively controlled, what that potential loss or result may be. And of course, encouraging reporting among our employees. Let us know if and where there are opportunities for improvement. And a short note here on reprisals for protection of not only a worker, but a supervisor as well. Keeping in mind, just as rights and duties for workers apply for our supervisors, so does this protection. So as a supervisor, protected through the legislation from reprisal or punishment of any type for fulfilling your obligations, such as communication of hazards and controls to workers, or even exercising your right to refuse unsafe work. And as a supervisor, again, being familiar that reprisals are prohibited. So as an individual who acts on behalf of the employer, not engaging in reprisals against workers. Now, for the point of competency that requires supervisors to be familiar with the regulations that apply to the work, this is a summary of the regulations that do apply to farming operations permanently, as well as on occasion, such as the example of construction projects, and even to some scope, the regulation related to washroom facilities and naloxone kits. Nonetheless, there are regulations to be familiar with as a supervisor within the context of your operations. And also to support that communication, as well as our understanding from the ministry perspective on interpretation related to that due diligence or reasonable precaution duty, there are some wonderful guidelines available from the basics of the legislation through to some of the specifics that are exposures within the sector. Tractors, large animal, hazardous atmospheres, and the few others that you see here. Great resources, another that we will share with you following the session. So as we move into some of the conversation on the practice of supervision and demonstration of a leader, I welcome you to share your insights. What are examples of tasks performed by a supervisor? What is it that you're in between the employer and worker role fulfill as their day-to-day or on occasion tasks? I welcome you to drop into the chat, and as you do, I'll share a few thoughts. A supervisor has a significant role in the performance of work. And quite often in this sector, the supervisor will be working right alongside those they may have responsibility over. It is important to be clear that the role of a supervisor is somewhat separate from the functional tasks on the farming operation. Driving the tractor is somewhat separate from the tasks of a supervisor that are set out within this legislation. The section we reviewed for the supervisor is really more about communication and performance management. It is not about how well you operate the equipment. That is you as a worker. So ensuring there is time available within your schedule to fulfill those duties of communication and performance management as a supervisor. Supervisors are effective as we fulfill our duties and achieve our goals, and of course efficient if we do so with the reasonable amount of resources and time, but it does require resources and time. Planning is one of the significant tasks, especially related to charge in a workplace. This is about setting goals and designing tasks, converting those into the practices that workers will perform within the workplace. So this will involve schedules, perhaps quality specifications, might involve expenses, and some of those communication efforts between not only workplace parties, but perhaps suppliers as well as customers. Organizing to accomplish those goals, ensuring that we do schedule effectively, not only the workers that we have responsibility over, but ourselves. And we do have that space within our day, week, month, and season to perform the tasks as a supervisor. Leading, which will lead us to leadership in a moment. We are in a role to guide, motivate, and lead others within the workplace, keeping that front of our mind that even when we do not believe anyone is looking or listening, they are. And even if they are not, the moment we may stray from the standard we would expect of our workers, we are no longer leading. Team building. Supervisors in informal and some of the time even formal ways are responsible to build that cohesive group that will work together to achieve those goals and objectives in the workplace. Now, team building may involve activities like coffee hour together to socialize, but team building is also about creating that culture where we do support each other in the performance of our work. We understand the capacities and skills of each other, and we utilize those in an effective and efficient way. And training, involving communication, a big part of our role as a supervisor, ensuring that workers have the information they need before they need the information. Set the workers up for success, just as the employer is to set the supervisor up for success. And even as I go, I welcome you to drop into the chat any of those additional tasks of a supervisor for your operations, if there are any unique or other that you wish to share. In being a supervisor, it is critical to keep in mind the strategies necessary to achieve those duties set upon your role. Most supervisors will model the behaviors or methods of their supervisors or your employers. And in some cases, this is great if those individuals were great leaders. In others, we might learn from some of the not so great experiences and improve upon those. So do be mindful. Do not procrastinate. Do your best to find solutions rather than the complaint about the issue. Come together with those who may be necessary, as well as thought on your own about what may resolve or solve some of those issues. Challenge yourself. Always look for new and different ways to encourage employees as well as yourself to innovate, create, so long as within the parameters of protection of their occupational health and safety. Setting those goals and objectives so we know where we are working toward and when we have arrived, and then the opportunity to reflect on how it went. Be supportive. Be able to step in and help others to make those decisions if and where necessary. Where we're able to, in looking for those solutions, streamlining processes, making it simple as reasonable and possible for workers to perform what the expectations are of them. Be resilient. Not everything will go according to plan. There will be an issue from time to time. Rather than take that failure personally, look forward, learn from, and implement that resilience among the team that you have responsibility over. And be approachable, which is often referred to as an open door, if you will. This is simply to demonstrate your access and also your need for your team to access you, not only to report when there is a concern, hazard, or perhaps even incident, but that regular conversation. So that culture is established if and where a worker does need and should request the support of the supervisor. It is without question. They have access to you, whether that is in person, since you are working side by side, through a door that is open for an office, or it is some communication device such as your phone. Your contact information is provided, and that worker can get a hold of you if and where necessary. So I'll ask you now if there are any qualities of leaders, which might be a touch different from that term supervisor, that are important for you. What are examples of leader qualities? What makes a supervisor a good supervisor versus a supervisor who may not be such a good supervisor? And as you consider, I'll share a few thoughts. And within this summary here, just to pick a few, an individual who is attentive, an effective communicator, respectful, empathetic, resourceful. And there are a few others, and likely in your own mind as you reflect on perhaps the best supervisor in your experience or learn from the not so best, there may be other qualities that you would suggest as important for a leader to have. Overall, an effective leader will grow others. Before you are a leader, success is about growing yourself. When you become a leader, success is about growing others. This quote from Jack Welch, who was a leader for many years in organizations such as General Electric and others, acknowledges that a win is no longer the promotion, the extra pay, maybe the earlier end within your schedule. It is no longer about you as an individual. It is about the others that you have responsibility over. Leadership truly is focused on purpose and culture, inspiring and motivating others in the workplace, explaining why the work is important and why the worker is important in the process. Individuals who are in the role of supervisors are leaders and have tremendous impact in the workplace. They move forward the workplace as well as progress the individuals that they support and have responsibility over. In being a leader, it is so important to believe in yourself. One of the fatal flaws of a supervisor is to not believe or to doubt your own abilities. If you are new, recognize that it will take some time to develop and become effective and efficient, and that is reasonable, just as it would be taking on any new task. As a leader, lead by example. Walk the talk, if you will. Ensure that you are practicing the standard you are expecting of your workers. And once more, even if you do not believe they are looking or listening, they may be, but even if they are not, complying with that standard, progressing that standard every moment of the workday is that nod toward culture in the workplace. Be active, consistent, and present. It is important that the workers you have responsibility over not only know what is expected of them, but know where you are, what is expected of you, how they can access you if and when necessary. Be willing to change. Things happen, issues arise, and that adaptability is an important feature of a leader. And some of the time it will be our workers who bring forward to us some of those innovative or opportunities for improvement in process, safety, and otherwise that are going to be so valuable for the operation if we make the change. Be accountable, acknowledge when things may not go right, and perhaps if you have made a mistake. Supervisors and leaders are human, just as all individuals in the workplace. Make a plan to learn from that experience and move forward. And communicate effectively. Communication is so vital within the workplace and the role of a supervisor, whether you are providing or receiving information. Allow for that effective space to provide and receive the information. And if you do ask for information from a worker, prepare to do something with that information. Some of the examples of information that you may communicate in the workplace include instructions, perhaps safety meetings or safety talks, and feedback. And feedback may be both constructive, discipline, as well as positive reinforcement. And just a few thoughts on each of these. Related to instructions, Keep in mind the principle of what's in it for me. Ensure that you do provide the context and objective within those instructions for your workers. How will they know when they have achieved the goal? And what if something goes wrong along the way? Forecast some of those experiences and share those within the instructions. Safety meetings and safety talks, or some of that more informal training, are wonderful methods to support ongoing and seasonal training across the workers you have responsibility over. Provide the opportunity for your workers to be involved, even as a guide within the conversation. Your seasoned, experienced, and effective tractor operator may be an awesome voice within that safety talk. And that peer-to-peer or mentor like experience within a tailgate talk is so impactful within this sector. And feedback, whether it is constructive or it is reinforcement of performance, ensure that not only we have provided the instruction, but also the process we will use for feedback before we provide that feedback to workers. If we come at workers with a written warning out of nowhere, a little more uncomfortable than necessary for both the supervisor and the worker. Communicate that standard ahead of the need to utilize feedback in both the constructive as well as the positive reinforcement. Now, one last question for you as we move toward the close. Resources. Are there resources you have come across as a supervisor or leader within your organization that are valuable for those in the role of a supervisor? And I'll share just a few with you. WSPS does have the Agriculture and Horticulture Safety Center, which includes resources for those in various roles in the workplace, including supervisors. Examples of tailgate talks, for instance, that might be useful to download, print, and utilize as personalized for your operations. Also, we have, beyond the Ag Port Center, general consulting and training resources, and in our Small Business Center, a safety roadmap that does highlight some of the duties that we have explored together today. And within some of the training offerings, topics specific for the supervisor, such as somewhat more formal information through safety, health, and the law, supervisor responsibilities and due diligence, as well as some less formal and even self-paced opportunities through refresher programs on due diligence and otherwise. The few other resources that I've mentioned along the way: supervisors under the Occupational Health and Safety Act from the ministry, as well as awareness training. It is a regulation, but does have some resources as well to fulfill those obligations, both the role of the supervisor and the role of the worker. I welcome you to connect with OFVGA and WSPS to support on the topic of supervisors, as well as in general on the topic of occupational health and safety. And with that, I thank you for joining the session. And if there are any questions at the chime of our end, I welcome you to drop those in the chat. And if not now, please do connect. Thank you for attending, and I look forward to meeting you again soon.
Thank you, Kristen. I always have questions, but since we're already at 1 o'clock, I think I'll save it for another day. It was had to do with my favorite topic of health and safety reps and how they would interact with supervisor kind of responsibilities, but I think we do that next time.
That sounds perfect. Absolutely. Yes, interact will be my short response, and then we'll explore that further.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your day.